Ooh.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations. It's Tuesday morning, the 24th of January, and we are studying Psalm 4 today. I know I've said this before, and I'll probably say it again, but I have no particular expertise in Psalms. So this class, it's been really wonderful for me to explore with you, to join together with you in understanding and connecting to these Psalms. And my hope is that a deep study of Psalms will lend itself toward spiritual connections in our lives, both when the Psalms relate to verses or liturgical connections that we have in our Jewish service, and also just the Psalms uh, in their own context. So we've looked at Psalms 1 through 3. We talked about how Psalms 1 and 2 are kind of like a unit, and some folks describe Psalms 3 through 14 as a unit. Some say 3 through 10. We're going to look at different ways of thinking about the Psalms and whether the connections between one Psalm and the next matter to our understanding of the Psalms themselves. This morning, we are going to look at Psalm 4, and as we have in the past, we're going to start by reading the Psalm out loud in Hebrew, so that we can hear how it sounds. Last week we talked about the lost music of the Psalms and how we just don't know what the musical tradition of these poems was, but there's hints to it. And again, in this week's Psalm, we find that the psalm it starts off saying, for the lead player, right, for the conductor. There's a notation that seems to be a musical notation at the top of this psalm, but of course the music is lost to us. But I do think that reading the Hebrew out loud gives us a sense of the musicality of the psalm, of its pauses and its structure. And then we're going to, as we have in the past, read through several translations of the psalm and talk about what those translations point us toward in terms of the spiritual and in terms of the meaning that we can get from this psalm. I'll be honest, this psalm, Psalm 4, is a psalm that there's very little of it that's used in Jewish liturgy. And reading through this psalm, I was like, wow, I know very little of this psalm jumps into my mind or into my heart. I was like, oh, Psalm 4, I don't really know this one very well. And so I look forward to studying it with you. One of the commentaries that I gave you in the source sheet is a meditation before saying Psalm 4. And I'd like to, before I read it out loud in Hebrew, I'd like to read the meditation, because I think it helps to contextualize the spiritual connection of this psalm. So the meditation before saying Psalm 4. I am eager to dialogue with those who have betrayed me, because I am confident that the Lord will hear my prayers. I don't want to fight with them. I wish they were sufficiently open-minded to hear my side of the story. My God is their God. Why can they not understand this? Why not forgive each other? We would accomplish so much if we could just work together. So I think the suggestion there is that a spiritual use of this psalm might be in thinking about people that you're having a hard time working with, for people that you feel have in some sense betrayed you. And indeed, this psalm is connected to Psalm 3 because it's still in David's running away from his son Avshalom. So we can talk about that more. Let me read the psalm in Hebrew. La menatzeach bin ginot mizmor leDavid, bekor'i aneni Elohei tzidki, batzar hirchavta li, choneni ushma tfilati. B'nei ish ad mech vodi lichlima, te'ehavun rik tivakshu chazav sela. U'de'u ki fla Adonai chasid lo, Adonai yishma bekor'i elav. Rigzu ve'al techetau, imru bilvavchem al mishkavchem v'domu sela. Zivchu zivchei tzedek uvitchu el Adonai. Rabim omrim, mi yar'enu tov nisa aleinu or panecha Adonai, natata simcha v'libi me'et deganam v'tirosham rabu, b'shalom yachdav eshkeva v'ishan, ki ata Adonai levadad lavetach toshiveni. All right, before we jump into our comparative translations, did anybody have any comments or things that they wanted to share about what it was like to read this psalm, or any thoughts that you have?
I looked at it as saying to God, don't sin, or God saying to us, don't sin and be righteous, and be happy with what we have, rather than compare ourselves to people who have a lot, like a lot of grain and wine. That's the way I interpret it.
Nice. Yeah, Henry.
So as I read all the variations, it seemed to me that it just reminded me of something that someone would say going to bed at night, the evening prayer that you want to say before you go to sleep. And I think the more I kept on reading it, the more I felt like, the last thing you want to do is think about things you want to say to get off your chest, or to say what you think about to God.
Nice. And we talked about how Psalm 3 is a traditional psalm used in the Kriyat Shema Lamita, the evening bedtime recitation of the Shema. That's one of the liturgical uses of Psalm 3. And Psalm 4 also has some of those same themes. And as you said, like in some ways, Psalm 4 may be even better for that use than Psalm 3. One thing that I noticed just structurally, before we even get to the meaning, is that Psalm 3 and Psalm 4 have the same rhythm to them, the same structure that starts with a verse that in some translations doesn't even count as part of the psalm, right? But in Jewish translations, that's verse 1. Then there's 2 verses and then a Selah, and then 2 verses and then another Selah, and then the rest of the psalm. And there is like a little bit of a mood shift in each of those, and also a person shift, like the psalmist is talking directly to God or is talking about God. And so it was interesting, sort of, when I prepare these source sheets, I'm comparing the immediate previous psalm to this one, because I open up the past source sheet and save it as the next one, and then I edit it. And so as I was going through, I was struck by how similar in structure these 2 psalms were. All right, so let's jump into some of our translations. I brought this week two translations that I hadn't brought in the past from Rabbi Eli Kashdan. This is the Koren Tehillim. It is from 2015. And we haven't looked at a translation from this book. And I brought for Psalm 4, I brought a translation from the Art Scroll Tehillim. And this is like the whole Tehillim with commentary. One thing that you'll notice from some of the translations this time is that some of the translators added in extra words, but they noted that they were adding in extra words by putting them in italics, right? It just didn't feel like it was clear enough of a translation without adding in extra words. And so let's look at these two translations side by side. The Koren, both of these are Orthodox Jewish translations. They're on, I think, the third page of the packet. Yeah, because of the way that I've been doing the columns and the section breaks, my headers, my footers seem to think that every time I do a new section, it's a first page again, and I have it not giving the page number on the first page. And when I do have it giving the page number, then it's giving me 1 a lot of times because it keeps thinking that it's resetting. Anyway, I'm hoping to fix this problem, but I obviously, it would be easier if I could just say, go to page 3. But anyway, so it's the page with Rabbi Eli Kashdan and Rabbi Yosef Marcus. Does somebody want to read the one on the left?
Sure.
All right.
For the chief musician with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. Answer me when I call, O my righteous God. When I was in distress, you freed me. Now have mercy on me and hear my prayer. You men of rank, how long will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love vanity and seek after falsehood? Selah. Know that the Lord has singled out the faithful for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Fear him, do not sing. Ponder on this when you rest in bed and be silent. Selah. Offer righteousness as your sacrifice and trust in the Lord. There are many who say, if only we might see better times. Let the light of your face shine upon us, O Lord. You have put in my heart greater joy than others have when their corn and wine abound. In peace I lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, keep me in safety.
Yeah, and especially there at the end, you do get the sense, right? In peace I lie down and sleep, that you might be saying this right at the end of the day, right? Or if you think about David running away from his son and the sort of historical moment of this psalm, then you're sort of, okay, this in peace I lie down and sleep is a different part of his fleeing than Psalm 3, where we said he was walking up the Mount Olives in haste, right? That didn't feel the same level of, okay, there's some security or some joy. There's a deeper resolution here at the end of this psalm, I think. Also note that in verse 5, it should have said, fear him, do not sin, not do not sing. That was a typo.
Oh, sorry.
No, I my typo. Anyway, yeah. All right. Any other? All right. Let's look at the one. Oh yeah, Gary, go ahead.
This psalm talks about, as you were just saying, about going to sleep. I think the previous one did also.
It did.
And my memory, because I think you taught Psalm 30 some time ago. And it also has something about going to sleep and getting up and feeling refreshed and all that. And I just wonder if that's a pretty common theme. I mean, it also made me think of the, Jacob wrestling with whoever he wrestled with an angel, as just, something is stressed out and going to bed and then feeling better. So I just wonder if that's a common theme in the liturgy and in the Psalms.
Yeah, I think so. And you pointed to several instances, and I do think that there are more. And as we go through the Psalms, let's keep a lookout for that sort of, like, you might be sad in the evening, but then joy comes in the morning. That kind of those kinds of responses. I do think that, especially in the ancient world, but also throughout history, like the anxiety of the night and the darkness is just a general theme of human existence, that nightmares come at night. All of the, busy brain comes at night. All the things that you don't let yourself think about during the day, whether you call them demons or whether you understand them as thoughts or psychological aspects of your psyche, or whether they're some physical manifestation that you're literally wrestling with. I think people do have that sort of sense of the night as a time of some terror, and the hope that morning's light brings a sense of relief. Alba.
Yeah, and Hashkivenu, may I lie down and wake up with life. That the very beginning of Hashkivenu. But the other thing is the word in peace and lie down and sleep. I have this feeling it has something to do with death, that when a person lies down and dies, they want to do so knowing that they lived a good life. And this made me think of Saving Private Ryan, because at the very end of the movie, when Private Ryan, now an older man, comes to visit the grave, everybody remember the movie? It was a great movie. When he comes to visit the grave, he asks his wife, tell me I'm a good man. Tell me I lived a good life. If everybody wants to hear that I lived a good life, that when I lie down and die and sleep forever, that I do so in peace and harmony.
Nice.
That have anything to do with anything?
No, I think it's a great connection. I brought on the last page, I brought a commentary from the Talmud on verse 5 of this psalm. So verse 5 is, tremble and do not sin. Say to your heart, upon your bed, and be still, Selah. So the Talmud brings a commentary that understands each phrase of this verse as being part of a conversation that a person is having with their Yetzer Hara, with their evil inclination, right? It says, tremble and do not sin. The Gemara mentions that Rabbi Levi Bar Chama said that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, one should always incite his good inclination against his evil inclination, meaning you should always struggle with you should always try to support your Yetzer Hatov, your good inclination, in its struggle against your inclination to do bad, your inclination to transgress. And how do you know from a biblical verse that you're supposed to do this? Because it says, tremble and do not sin, right? Tremble meaning cause your good inclination to war against your evil inclination, and do not sin, because if you do that, then you won't transgress. Okay, so then the Talmud says, if one succeeds and subdues the evil inclination, great, you did it. Yasher koach. But if you do not succeed in subduing your evil inclination just through your good inclination, which I think most of us do not, then you should study Torah, because studying Torah will bolster your good inclination, your Yetzer HaTov, to be able to subdue your evil inclination. And that's the next phrase of the verse where it says, say to your heart. And say to your heart, that is a reminder to study Torah. Okay, now if you subdue your evil inclination, great, you did it. Yasher koach. But if you struggle even after studying Torah, then on the next level of your struggle against the Yetzer Hara should be to recite Shema, right? Which is about accepting the divine oneness, the divine unity, and the concept of reward and punishment, right? And it's a prayer. So if study didn't work, maybe prayer will work, and specifically a prayer that opens you up to an understanding of God. And how do we know that you should say the Shema? Because the next phrase in the verse says, upon your bed, and bed here is mishkavchem, which alludes to the Shema because mishkavchem is not a very common word, and in the Shema it says uveshochbecha, when you lie down in bed. So the root is the same. So if if the psalm is going to use this particular word to mean upon your bed, it must be alluding to saying the Shema. Okay, if studying Torah, having a good inclination, and saying the Shema allows you to subdue your impulse to sin, great. But if not, then you should remind yourself of the day of death. You should remind yourself that life is finite, and that reminder of the finite nature of life is sort of your last recourse to living a good life, which is why I brought this after Alba's comment, right? Like, you want to be able to say, I lived a good life. So thinking about your own death might help to subdue your evil inclination. And that's the Talmud says the day of your death is alluded to in the silence of the words "and be still," Selah. And so, right, verse 5 is understood by the Talmud to be a whole series of instructions for how to avoid sin. What do you think? So I guess when I saw this verse, this section from the Talmud, as I was looking to prepare, I wondered whether this was completely taking verse 5 out of context. And that is how I was going to present it when we got there later in the class. I was going to say, so here's an interesting out of context thought about this. But when Alba points out that this "and be still" is not the only possible allusion to death, sleep is also a possible allusion to death. And I wonder if there's actually more to this in the psalm than I was giving it credit for in the first place. Mishka.
Did I?
I'm looking at the stone edition of the Sonsino Chumash, and I'm just struck by the fact that in this translation it says "be utterly silent," which I don't see necessarily. I mean, this is just that translation. Utterly silent being death. It's being that reflective space.
Right. So the Art Scroll translation, which we were about to read from Rabbi Yosef Marcus, says "and be silent forever." That's pretty close to "and be utterly silent." Certainly,
Mhm.
if you have and be silent forever, it's hard not to think of death. The Hebrew word vidomu, and be silent, doesn't necessarily have within it that finality, but that is a very common like Jewish interpretation. And in fact, in part because of this this interpretation from the Talmud. My hunch there is that Sonsino's translation is informed by the Talmudic discourse on this verse.
Certainly makes sense.
Certainly the Art Scroll translation makes no effort to hide the fact that it translates based on based on rabbinic interpretations of the psalm,
Mhm.
right? Like, for example, here in verse 7, many crave wealth and say, who will show goodness to us, right? Crave wealth completely added in, but added in like based on an interpretation of that psalm, not added in, all on his own. All right, let's look at Rabbi Richard Levy's translation. That's on the second page, the right-hand column. Somebody else like to read it? All right, Gary, you just have to unmute.
With a conductor with instrumental music, a
Oh
song by
no, not that one. On the second page, the Richard Levy, it starts to the conductor on strings.
There.
to the conductor on strings, a psalm of David. When I call out, answer me, God of my vindication. When I was confined, you opened broad vistas for me. Show me your grace. Listen to my prayer. You people, how long will my honor be humiliated? You are in love with emptiness. You chase after falsehood, Selah. But know that Adonai has set apart the righteous one as God's own. Adonai listens when I call out. So tremble and do not sin. Speak with your heart upon your own bed and be silent. Offer offerings of justice, which will gain you vindication, and trust in Adonai. Many say, who will show us what is good? Show us the light of your presence, Adonai. You have placed a joy in my heart greater than the seasons, whose grain and oil pour out in profusion. In peace I lie down, I am one with sleep, for you alone, Adonai, let me dwell in safety. That is the right one, isn't it?
Yeah, that was the right one. I think, yeah. So what do you think about the tone of this one versus some of the other ones we just looked at?
What I noticed, I'm not sure I can compare it right off the top of my head, but the speaker is not speaking, I think, from a place of humility, but from a place of authority. That he's got the right idea, and why don't other people do what he says?
Right, which makes sense in the historical context of, right, David's the rightful king, not his son. But also, right, the thinking about how to use this psalm spiritually, like we generally think of ourselves that we are right.
Mhm.
Like the speaker often thinks of themselves as being in the right. Yeah, I'm the righteous one. God's gonna listen to my prayers. The rest of you, you've got emptiness and falsehood. Why can't you just see it my way?
It's also easier to read because it doesn't refer to God in the masculine.
Right. So yeah, the sometimes Rabbi Levi's translations are easier to read because of the because he doesn't refer to God in a gendered way, and sometimes the circumlocutions actually make it harder. But I think he does a beautiful job of crafting the translation of the psalm, like, you know, in a way that manages to preserve that non-gendered translation of God. All right, I'd like to do something a little different than we've done in the past few weeks, and I wish I had just made a page with all of the psalm, all of the verse 2s, but I didn't do that. But if I ever want to do this again, I will. But I'd like us to go through and just read the translations of verse 2 in each translation, and just talk about like what is being focused on in each translation of verse 2. So I'm going to read them.
Rabbi, can you
Yeah.
start first by reading it in Hebrew, please?
Sure. Verse 2. Bikori aneni Elohei tzidki, batsar hirchavta li, choneni ushma tfilati. When I call out, answer me, my righteous God. In the straits, you set me free. Have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. When I call out, answer me, God of my vindication. When I was confined, you opened broad vistas for me. Show me your grace and listen to my prayer. Answer me when I call, O my righteous God. When I was in distress, you freed me. Now have mercy on me and hear my prayer. Answer me when I call, O God, who knows my righteousness. You have relieved me in my distress in the past. Be gracious to me now as well, and hear my prayer. This is actually the first verse of the Christian translations. When I call, answer me, O God of my righteousness. You who have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Answer me when I call, O God of my right. You gave me room when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Answer me when I call, God who vindicates me. You freed me from affliction. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. When I call, answer me, O God of my righteousness. In the tight place, you made it broad for me. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. So what do you think of what do you make of the slightly different translations? I want to, what do you think? I have a couple of thoughts, but before I give, what is different in some of these translations? Yeah, Gary.
I'm not sure this gets at what you're thinking of, but I think Tsar gets translated differently as narrow place. Oh, what is this? Sorry. If I.
No. Okay, great. So one of the phrases is Batsar hirchavta li, from a narrow place, you widened it out, you gave me space. That, right? Sometimes the narrow place is translated as straits, sometimes confined, sometimes distress. right? And the word tsar means distress, but it means distress in the same way that being confined, right? You gave me room, right? You widened it out when I was in distress. You give me relief when I was in distress. You freed me from affliction. That tsar is affliction there. Here, a tight place is tsar. And if we go to Rabbi Richard Levy here on verse 2, one of the commentaries I brought, the Hebrew word tsar means narrow place, the image of someone being trapped in the straits, hemmed in. This is one of the interpretations of Mitzrayim, which is usually translated as Egypt, where the Israelites were enslaved, suggesting the psychological aspects of oppression, where choices are closed off. The poet acknowledges that in the past, God has widened their vistas, much like the praise of God in Psalm 118, Min hametzar karati ya, anani vamerchav ya, right? And I bolded the words that are the same, right? From the tsar and the merchav, right? Also the widening, from within the narrow space, I cried out, Yah, the Holy One answered me in Yah's expansive space, the expanse of the merchav. Great. So opened vistas is how Rabbi Richard Levy translates this. Alba.
Yeah, there's a time during the year which is called Bein HaMetzarim. It's a few weeks after Shavuot, and it's right there in the summer solstice. And there's these 3 weeks between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av, when you have Bein HaMetzarim, between the straits, between a rock and a hard place. And from Ulysses, they have this, in English, sometimes we say, I'm caught between Scylla and Charybdis, but nobody knows that reference anymore. So sometimes my dad used to say, I'm caught between a rock and a hard place. You can't maneuver here. And so in the summertime is the best time, for hail storms and flash floods and drought, and some army comes plodding through your crops and stuff. And it's like, it's what's outside of you, these things that you can't control. You say, look, I'm going through this narrow area. It'd be really nice if I knew they weren't going to hold a war this week, or that, the weatherman says there isn't going to be this hailstorm. And so the Tsad, Bein HaMetzarim, and the Tsad trapped between these two things, and just try to get through this space,
Great.
Which is
what I love about your comment, Alba, is that you point out that where Rabbi Levy sort of understands Mitzrayim, translating Mitzrayim as from the narrow place, right, as a psychological understanding of oppression, of slavery, right? Mitzrayim also refers to something physical in the real world. There's a real physicality aspect to it. And I heard a commentator say that the reason why Mitzrayim is called the narrow place is because in the ancient world, Egypt basically was a narrow country on either sides of the banks of the Nile, right? The Nile overflowed, and because of the Nile overflowing, there was abundant agriculture, but just a couple of miles each direction from the Nile River. And so, right, you go too far out in either direction and it's just desert. And so the reason why Mitzrayim might have been called Mitzrayim by the biblical authors is because it's in fact a physically narrow country. It's like a long strip along a river. And you're pointing out that in the summer, there are these physical barriers, the rock and the hard place, the destruction of the walls and the destruction of the temple, the possibility of an army coming through, the physical straits, the physicality of this also comes through in in the psalm. It's not just a psychological broad vista, but an actual physical space, which I love. Yeah, Gary, you had your hand up.
But what I was trying to think of before was just that in Psalm 3, Sarai was translated as people, and tormentors, as you know, not as difficulties or tight spaces, but as people.
Great, right? The ones who the ones who were my adversaries, right?
Right.
Marabut Sarai.
Yep.
The people who are against me are so many. Yeah, and here, right, Batsar really relates to some kind of aspect of distress, as opposed to Sarai meaning the ones who distress me. Yeah, nice. Good connection. And the word Tsar does come up a lot in Psalms. Nice. Mishka.
As a retired therapist, I thought about this as a very personal thing where people have their own narrow straits and they're stuck between thinking one way, feeling one way, and having relief, perhaps, in terms of the struggles one has for themselves or with other people. I think a lot about couples counseling and such, where you have to find relief. You're looking for relief from those internal struggles or interpersonal struggles, not just the external ones.
Yeah, and certainly, right, this psalm lends itself both toward both interpretations, and I think, you know, good poetry should lend itself toward a mixed possibilities. And when we think about how to use this psalm spiritually, when might you, in your own personal prayer practice, recite this psalm, right? You might do it when there's a physical constriction or a psychological or socio-emotional constriction. When you feel hemmed in, when you feel like your choices are being taken from you, when you feel like there isn't when you feel like you don't have a lot of room to maneuver. Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And if you're keeping track, you know, for your own spiritual purposes, like what psalms might be useful for me in my life, right? You might put this one in the category of a psalm that I could say when I feel constrained, a psalm that I could say when I don't know, when I don't feel like I have enough choices. Great. So the other aspect of verse 2 that I wanted to point out was the struggle that the translators had with translating Elohei Tzidki, God of my righteousness, or my righteous God, or God of my vindication, right? Some of the translators seem to have Tzedek as describing God, as in Robert Alter's translation, answer me, my righteous God. And some of the translators seem to have the tzedek describing the person, the psalmist, the speaker, and some, as in, for example, the Rabbi Yosef Marcus Art Scroll version that says, "Oh God, who knows my righteousness," right? It's my righteousness, and God, you know I'm righteous, right? And some kind of chart a middle course between, like, whose righteousness is it? I think here, God of my vindication, Rabbi David Levy's approach is kind of a middle ground, because it's my vindication, but it's my vindication because you're the God of it, right? That is, it's still using the phrase tzidki to describe God, but it's saying, you know, it's my vindication that describes God, as opposed to just that God is tzedek, that God is righteous. And so each of these translators had to try to figure out how to make sense of that phrase in English. And I just think that it's really interesting to see the different the different responses. O God of my right. O God of my righteousness. God who vindicates me. Yeah. Any other thoughts about verse 2? All right. Oh, so this phrase Elohei Tzidki, I brought a radak also on that phrase.
You want to wait?
It is certain that this psalm likewise was uttered by David in his flight before Avshalom.
Yeah.
And he says, answer me when I call, O God, judge of my righteousness. For thou knowest that with me is the right, and with him who is against me, the wrong and the violence, right? Avshalom is in the wrong. And thou, Lord, art judge over us. Now, how does Radak get to this idea of judgment? Because the name for God that is used here is Elohim, Elohei Tzidki. And that word, the word Elohim, means judge. That's God's judge. God as judge is what Elohim means. For in every instance where Elohim occurs, it has the meaning judge. And then he gives some examples. So for example, in Psalm 58, it says, verily there is a God that judges the earth. And there Elohim is used to mean God in judgment. And also men who are judges are also called that. And then there's a verse from Exodus 22 where it says, and the people shall come forth before the Elohim. And there, it doesn't mean the God, it means they come forth before the human judges. And also in Exodus 21, then his master shall bring him unto the Elohim, unto the judges. So it's so Radak doing a close reading, like why this name for God is used here is because God is being invoked as the judge of righteousness. So
have a
Elohei
question.
Tzidki means God who
I'm sorry.
judges my righteousness. Yeah, Alba.
Sorry, I have to cut across here.
No,
I have
go
a
ahead.
question about the translators. Is Alan P. Ross and Walter Brueggemann, are they Christian?
Yes.
Okay, I have this question. Look at, and in number 2, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. And then if you go down to the Christian Standard Bible, and James Hamilton, I think you told me was also Christian.
Yep.
Told
Also
us.
Christian.
Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Okay, well, is there like a compendium of ways to translate things for the Christians? Because the same thing happens in verse 5, where they have 5, where they have this thing of offer right sacrifices, offer sacrifices of righteousness, offer right. Do they have a certain political thing about choosing certain translations? Because in number 2, verse 2, which is verse 1 for Ross and Brueggemann, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. They repeat this constantly. So I was wondering if there were some times for Christians in their general political makeup that certain set phrases are always translated the same way, or is that just a coincidence here?
So verse 2, I think, has 2 phrases that are very challenging to translate. Elohei Tzidki, God of my righteousness, hard to know exactly what that means. And Batsar Hirchavta li, right? Like, what does exactly mean that you gave me an expansiveness in response to my constriction, right? So both of those get translated a lot of different ways.
Mhm.
But the word choneni, like the Hebrew name Chana,
Yeah.
means grace, like an grace as in an undeserved gift, right? Have grace on me. When we pray for God's grace, we mean even though we don't deserve it, still show us kindness, right? And whether you translate it as have grace on me, or whether you translate it as show me your grace, or whether you translate it as have mercy on me, all of those, like choneni basically means that, grace. And also it is true, right? Some of the Jewish translators, I think, struggle a little bit more with the word grace in English because
Mm.
it's been so used by Christianity. But
Mm.
I would say to our detriment, right? We Jewish people should talk more about God's grace and God's love, right? I think it's to our detriment that we shy away, that we want to replace the word grace with the word mercy. Not that mercy isn't a good translation, but I think that the point that you're making, wow, there seems to be a lot of consistency in translating the word choneni as grace in the Christian translations and less consistency in the Jewish translations. I wonder if that points to a challenge that Jewish readers have with the word grace, and our translators know that they want to make sure that it doesn't, that it's understood what it means, and so they're trying to be gracious to me instead of saying have grace on me. Have grace on me sort of feels more Christian, right? Be gracious to me, that's that feels the same as, say, the priestly blessing, right? And be gracious to me, right? And be gracious to you, right?
Does the do you have, oh, because it has always bothered me, how does a Christian, when they hear the word grace, like in amazing grace, how sweet thou art, grace, what do they hear when they hear the word grace? I'm not sure
Well,
I'm hearing the same thing they hear.
So, right. So let me say that I am not a Christian, and I'm not I don't want to speak for Christians.
Mm.
And I'm sure that many Christians and different sects of Christianity have different, specific relationships to the concept of grace. But
Yeah.
what the word means theologically is an undeserved gift. An undeserved gift. Now, we actually are not all Jewish on this call, and my colleague, Reverend James McDonald, might be able to speak more to this question of grace. If I can
don't
put
see
you on the
his
spot.
name.
Sure. No, that's fine. I think you're right,
Oh,
Alba.
there he is.
I think that the Christians, we have baggage when it comes to that word, because St. Paul, who wrote the letters in the New Testament, or the Hebrews, or the Christian scriptures, has a very different twist on good works and what good works do. And his take was that our good works are not enough, that we need God's grace in order to be saved. And that's what we were talking about last week, salvation. Christians are obsessed with salvation. And so how do you become saved? You do good works? No. You have to have God's mercy or God's grace. So it's that distinction between works and grace that Martin Luther highlighted later, and that evangelical or more conservative Christians continue to want to highlight today. Does that help?
that's getting me closer. It's getting me closer. The idea of, it's getting me closer. I'm sure studying more Psalms is going to help.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? We are studying these Psalms in translation, which means that we are stuck in some sense in the English in our English associations of what these words mean, right? And the word grace has, as James said, it has all of this baggage, in our English lexicon. And I think that you're pointing to the hymn Amazing Grace is like exactly right? When we think about grace in a general cultural context, it's in hymns like that, which have like a specific theological meaning in Christianity that for those of us who are not deeply immersed in Christian thinking, we might have a harder time with. And like I said, I think that it's not an accident that the Jewish translations of this text struggle with translating that word simply as grace, because they don't want it to feel foreign or Christian to their Jewish audience. But the word, you meet a lot of folks named Hannah, and maybe you don't think that that's the same as naming your child Grace, but it is. Yeah, Gary.
Oh, darn.
I had another thing that there was difficulty in the translation, and that I think had a Jewish Christian separation as well, and that was B'nai Ish, which gets translated as sons of man, or you people, or you men of rank, or you sons of men, which is a little different from son of man. And I think Jesus is described as having applied the term son of man to himself in the Gospels. And so I didn't quite, and on the other hand, some people describe it as you important people. Benish as you important people. And so I didn't quite get all of that. But I would like to be elucidated about it.
Yeah, good. Let's put a pin in that question. We can come back to it. I do think that, a lot of the translations point out that the word ish here doesn't just mean person, but it means people of rank or important people or exalted ones. But not all of the translators agree. One of them translates it as you people, and in the notes to the translation actually literally wrote, I didn't use this because of its gendered terminology, but it might be the right translation to just translate it as you guys. There's supposed to be a kind of familiarity, or which goes back to how might you use this psalm and what does this psalm do for us spiritually. It's the people who can betray you the most are usually people who you already cared about a lot, and so you're familiar with them, you're on a first name basis with it. You guys, why can't you just see it my way? And so that might be a translation of that phrase, but there is a strong tradition of it meaning important people and not just general people. We didn't have time to discuss it because we've reached our time boundary, but the other hard verse, I think, to translate is this verse about joy and grain and wine. And there were a lot of different versions of how to translate that. That's verse 7. If you want, go through and compare all the different verses 7. And I think you'll find, the translators really struggled with what that means. and reading it in Hebrew, it's very hard to understand. It is not clear at all what that verse is exactly referring to. I think
We'll do that.
you have put gladness in my heart more than when their grain and wine abound. Like, then I'm left with who is there? Like, who does the grain and wine belong to? What are you talking about there? I think, right, Rabbi Levi translates it as seasons, like greater than the seasons whose grain and oil pour out in profusion. Then who the they is the seasons of the year. That I wouldn't have thought of except for it was in this translation. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for joining with me this week. Next week we'll look at Psalm 5, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good night.
Are you gonna go away really quick? I wanted to, just these
Yeah,
three
yeah.
different